Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. When it comes to earthly disputes, what is usually at the heart of the matter? Usually it is pride, which leads to all sorts of other sins. But other times it is money. When it comes to the work of the church, there have been countless disputes as to the scope of this work, with some saying that the church is to be benevolent to the whole world, Christians and non-Christians, while others saying that the church can only be benevolent to saints, leaving individuals to be benevolent to those in the world. The only way to settle such disputes is to look to the church found in Scripture, the church that Jesus built, and the local churches that the apostles helped establish. What did they do? Well, here in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, we get another piece of the puzzle. So if you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. We're going to be reading from verses 1 through 12. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Corinthians chapter 16, beginning at verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must also do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. Now I will come to you when I pass through Macedonia, for I am passing through Macedonia. And it may be that I will remain or even spend the winter with you, that you may send me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you, if the Lord permits. But I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost, for a great and effective door has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. And if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear, for he does the work of the Lord, as I also do. Therefore let no one despise him, but send him on his journey in peace, that he may come to me, for I am waiting for him with the brethren. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren. But he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. Coming now to chapter 16, and we get this familiar phrase in 1 Corinthians, now concerning. This has acted as a transitional phrase since chapter 7 to separate the different sections of this book. The first 6 chapters dealt with Paul's corrections about divisions that he had heard from the house of Chloe, while the remaining 10 chapters have dealt with answering different questions that the Corinthians sent to Paul. We've talked about marriage during the times of persecutions, meats offered to idols, which included discussions of submission to our head and the Lord's Supper, and we talked about spiritual gifts. This last topic started in chapter 12 and ended at the end of chapter 15, with the reason they should desire prophecy, in order to avoid being led astray, especially by those claiming that there was no resurrection of the dead, arguments that some in Corinth seem to be sympathetic to. Now we come to the collection for the saints. What collection is this? Well, we've read about this before, twice in fact. The first time we read about it is in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 24, in verse 17, we read, Now after many years I came to bring alms and offerings to the nation. In that passage, Paul is defending himself before Felix, the Roman governor of Judea, giving him the reason for his coming. Thus, this account is after the alms had already been brought and distributed among the churches in Judea. But in our last study of Romans, we read of it too. For in Romans chapter 15, verses 25 to 28, we read, But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors. For if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things. Therefore, when I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, I shall go by way of you to Spain. When we studied Romans, we noted that it was highly likely that Paul wrote Romans while staying 3 months in Corinth, according to Acts 20, verse 3. So the collection he speaks of in Romans is the same one Paul speaks of here in 1 Corinthians, the difference being that by the time that Paul wrote Romans, the collection had already been collected, and Paul was preparing to actually take it to Jerusalem. When Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, we can therefore know that it was before Paul had reached Corinth. In fact, this chapter tells us that Paul was at Ephesus. We can also know which visit to Ephesus this was, for in Acts 19, verses 21 and 22, it says, "When these things were accomplished," which had been in Ephesus, "Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must also see Rome.' So he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a time." Acts 19 mentions Paul's trip to Macedonia and Achaia, which is where Corinth is, and it even mentions that Paul sent Timothy ahead of him, which Paul mentions here in 1 Corinthians 16. So piecing the timeline together, Judea is in need of help for the needy saints there, a condition that Paul knew about. Paul told the churches of Galatia about it, Galatia being on the east part of Turkey, and they would send some funds to Judea using the example that Paul would later tell the Corinthians. Paul told the Corinthians about these instructions in his letter to them written while in Ephesus and likely delivered to them by Timothy. Paul was going to wait to hear about the Corinthians' reception to this letter, so he stayed in Asia for a while. He would later come to Corinth, where he would stay 3 months, and while there, write the book of Romans. From Corinth, he would sail to Jerusalem to deliver this aid, and while there, would be arrested, jailed for 2 years, before finally appealing to Caesar in Rome, which led us to the end of the book of Acts. It is interesting to piece together Paul's journeys and place his writings in context where we can, so that we realize that these letters were not written in a vacuum. They were written to actual churches that Paul visited. And so we find that the collection that Paul speaks of is again a collection for the saints. As far as collections go, thus far in our study of the New Testament, we only have seen that churches have collected money for needy saints, not for those in the world. We have seen in the book of Romans where individual Christians are told to be helpers of the poor of all people, but the church wasn't given that instruction. In Acts, time and time again, it was needy Christians that the church helped. Now we have instructions here in 1 Corinthians 16. I hope you can see that we're seeing a pattern. Individual Christians help all, including Christians and non-Christians, while the local church collective helps saints in need. Now, this is not to say that the pattern will necessarily continue, but as we continue our travel through the New Testament scripture, let's see if it does. Regardless, though, this specific collection was for needy saints, and so we can know that for sure. What instructions did Paul give to the Corinthians about this collection? Well, the first instruction is that they were to take up this collection on the first day of the week. Why this day? Because we know from Scripture that the church met on this day, especially to partake of the Lord's Supper. And so if there wasn't to be any collections when Paul came, this would be a convenient time to take up this collection. How often were they to take up this collection? Well, the New King James simply says on the first day of the week, but the translations that use a different set of ancient New Testament codices to translate the New Testament than the New King James does, says the first day of every week, meaning this wasn't just a one-week collection. If you just had the New King James Version, though, you could infer that from the text simply because Paul hadn't arrived yet and wouldn't for quite a number of weeks or months, and so these collections would continue until Paul arrived, so that there weren't any collections for this specific work needed still to be made when Paul came. By necessary inference, then, the church must have had a treasury, a storehouse for the money collected that would be accessible when Paul arrived, so that he could then bring the money with him to Jerusalem. Was everyone in Corinth expected to give the same amount? No, for the instruction was for every Christian to lay something aside purposely as he is prospered by God. Purposeful giving is not forced giving like taxes are. It is a voluntary gift for this work. And since everyone is prospered by God differently, it was only right that the gift be made according to that, so that givers didn't feel that they needed to impoverish themselves or neglect their family's needs just to be involved in this work. That tells us something. We need to examine our own life situation when we give. How has God prospered me? And by this, we're not just talking about dollars and cents or whatever currency you might have in your home country. We're also talking about looking at your family situation too. A single person making $1,000 is much more prospered than a married man with a family of 4 making the same $1,000. In that case, the single person may say that they can give $200, while the married man, after providing for the needs of their family, may determine that they can only give $100. You see, we're not simply talking about the quantity of money you've made, we're also talking about the life situation, which would include the city that you live in. Every person is prospered differently, and so each person gave differently. The choice is between you and God, not between you and the church. This giving was not meant to be seen as a tax, but from Romans we learned was meant to be seen as a ministry to help those in need. How is this money sent? Not simply by Paul, for the Corinthians were to select men to travel with Paul or to be sent on ahead after Paul arrived to carry this gift to the church in Jerusalem. Why did Paul say this? Well, first of all, this gift was going to be quite large, so more manpower was necessary. But another reason is so that these men could report back to the Corinthians that the gift got to Jerusalem and was not embezzled by Paul or anyone else. Churches would be wise to use similar methods of sending financial aid today. For North American churches, it is often not feasible to always send someone with cash, and since wire transfers are so easy, money is simply sent to the church directly or to a member of that church who then gives the money to the church. These North American churches need to be careful when doing so, that too much money isn't sent to one person, lest that person, who might be poor themselves, be tempted to take a little for themselves. Using multiple messengers is always better, as Paul directs here. It appears that when Paul arrived in Corinth, it was going to be his design to send some of these messengers by themselves to Jerusalem to bear this gift, so as not to delay it. But if the brethren in Corinth wanted Paul to accompany this gift, then these messengers would travel with Paul, as we do see happening in Acts 20. As to when Paul would arrive, he was planning on passing through Macedonia, after which he would come to them and, if possible, even spend the winter with them. Paul didn't want to see them right away due to the fact that he wanted them to correct some of the problems that they had before his arrival, as he said in chapter 4. Instead, he planned to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, which would be early June, for a door of opportunity had been opened to him there where he could be useful, something we read of in Acts 19. Instead, as we said earlier, Paul would send Timothy to them, who does the work of the Lord just as Paul does, meaning that Timothy was a preacher. Nobody was to despise him, for Timothy was still quite young, but were to follow his instructions as coming from Paul, and then send him away in peace so that he could return to Paul with a report. What of Apollos, somebody that they also seemingly asked Paul about? Paul strongly urged him to come to Corinth, but he didn't will to at that time. One of two things could be going on. One, Apollos could have been busy with the preaching he was doing and couldn't spare the time. Or two, Apollos had heard what was going on at Corinth with the factions over preachers of eloquence, and so didn't want to return to Corinth until they had time to make corrections, so that he, like Paul, could come to them in joy. Whatever the case, Paul told them that Apollos would come to them, but when he had more convenient time. Before closing, I would like to back up and make one more point, which is more expedient to make now than before, and it concerns the collection. There are some Christians who seem to have the view that the church shouldn't take up weekly collections and have a permanent treasury because they believe the church in the first century didn't do that. And so, if there's no work for the church to do, it shouldn't take up a collection. Well, this chapter does talk about a specific work that the Corinthians were collecting for. But where do we get the idea that the Corinthians didn't take up collections to do other works of the church that God has authorized? No, it doesn't appear they supported preachers, or at least Paul. But they did do evangelism, which might have cost money. Did they need to secure a place to meet, which might cost money? People assume that every church in the first century met in houses, and while many did, The church in Corinth, from what we read of in this book, was quite large, and so they likely required a larger space. Now, perhaps one of the members had a large enough space, who knows? But if God commands the church to meet, and he does, then by generic authority, the church needs to secure a place to meet, which may cost money that will need to be collected. My point is, certainly if the church has no work to do, then don't take up a collection simply to collect money. But if the church is not working, what is it doing? Why is it not teaching the lost, edifying the saved, supporting needy saints, supporting preachers? All of these things are scriptural, and all of these things should be engaged in by local churches as they have ability. And that, of course, would require first day of the week giving, as we have no example of another day of the week in which Christians gave to the church in the scriptures. A church that isn't working is a church that is dying, or a church that has already died. There's always more God-given work for the church to do, and so as congregations, we should see value in accomplishing this work, in saving the souls of the lost and helping needy saints, that we are motivated to give, just as the Corinthians were, for this particular work of helping needy saints here in Judea at the end of 1 Corinthians. Paul pointing out this particular work doesn't exclude any other work that the church might have, and so let's not twist scriptures in order for easing our responsibility to be involved in the local church in any way we can, and as God prospers us. We'll conclude our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Corinthians, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 to 24, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.